reading in my life is relaxation. You feel better afterwards.
Hello and welcome to Tsundoku, the podcast for people who love books old and new. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
Kath Keneally here.
And I'm Sarah Martin.
That's it. We've got the whole gang here because it's nearly Christmas and we've just had a little Christmas lunch and now we're going to have a chit-chat about the books that we loved this year and the books that we'd like to find in our stocking.
But first, of course, we know you tune in to hear our chats with some great authors and we've got some lovely interviews coming your way today.
I'm going to kick off with a book by Robbie Arnott, one of my favourite authors, author of Limberlost, which is the book I loved reading most last year. I love Robbie Arnott's writing. His stories are just engrossing. With a light touch, he draws really honest and beautiful pictures of nature and of the people and of the animals that inhabit these really beautifully drawn scenes. His characters are usually quite stoic and brave, but they're also oftentimes somewhat inarticulate, and I find in his books the actions of his characters speak a lot more loudly than their words. And I just love reading Robbie's words on the page. So it was really an honour to speak to him when he came to Adelaide on tour. And which book are you bringing us,
I'm
Sarah?
bringing the second book by Hannah Ferguson. She's a young media leader. She's a CEO and co-founder of an organisation called Cheap Media, and she's also started up her own podcast. And it's aimed squarely at young adults, so young women in their early 20s charting their way through the world. And so her book Taboo is what we pull apart today.
Okay, well, let's kick off with Dusk. It's the story of 37-year-old twins Iris and Floyd. They're down on their luck. In fact, they've actually never had any luck. Their parents were ex-convicts and they were a couple who used to use their children to rob and steal their way to the next meal. Things went from bad to worse and the twins finally ran away. They've been drifting from job to job all their lives and now they find themselves in the Tasmanian highlands in pursuit of a puma called Dusk. There's a bounty on its head because it's been killing sheep and people, and they desperately want to finally make a good paycheck. With Robbie on tour, I mused on whether book tours were a time when authors get asked those same questions over and over again.
Look, I'm not getting sick of any questions because it's just an honour to be read, I think. I'm pretty resilient with all that stuff and pretty just engaged with anything. There's a question that I'm not getting sick of, but I'm just worried I always have a bad answer to.
What is that?
Well, Dusk is about a puma in somewhere like the Tasmanian highlands in some time like the late 18th century, killing lots of sheep and also killing people. There's a bounty on its head. And quite naturally, a lot of people are assuming I've based this on the myths of big cats in the Australian landscape, which is really reasonable. It's just not what I did. And so this is coming up a lot and I'm having to come up with ways to say, oh, that is very interesting. It just wasn't what I was doing at the time. And I don't want to lie, but I also don't want to cut someone off. So that's tripping me up a little. I've got to get better at that.
Well, you can practice with me now. So what was the answer you'd like to give to that?
Really, I was just much more interested in this, not only the brutalities and horrors of the colonial period and the ongoing colonial period, but some of the strangeness that occurred, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries, where entire species were shipped back and forth and up and down across the globe on the whims of landed gentry and invaders, in something that at the time was strange and looking back now is even stranger, which was why we have foxes and cane toads and rabbits all throughout Australia and why in the Tasmanian highlands we have deer, which are churning up a very precious environment ecosystem that evolved for millions of years with no hooved animals around it.
Yeah. People treated nature as if it was just something curious, not real.
Yeah, and the mindset, which is still ongoing today, but was even more prevalent then, that humanity rules over all and everything else is essentially a plaything, which is something that sits uncomfortably with me, and it's probably clear in my work.
It is.
But I am very fascinated by, so I think I'm drawn towards writing about that.
Yeah. I was interviewing Marcus Suzak not so long ago and he says that he knows he has a story when he gets that first line. And I was wondering, what was your inspiration or when did you know you had this book?
Oh, I'm about 20,000 words in before I know whatever I'm working on is going to make it to being a novel.
Yeah.
It's until I can really feel like I'm running with it and it's going somewhere. I don't even know how it will end, but I do need to know that there's enough momentum behind it that I'll get to the finish line.
Yeah.
But yeah, it takes a bit to get there.
I'm always interested in people's creative process and how they work. In between, say, Limberlost and this one, were there books that you just started and jettisoned, or was this the next one and only next one?
Yeah, a few false starts, a few things I've worked on and put aside. Get up to a few thousand words and work away at something, try and figure out a landscape, figure out a character, figure out a story. It's kind of how I do it.
Yeah.
And then realise that it might be a semi-neat idea, but it's not enough to actually make a novel. There's always a few of them floating around, which you think you might return back to, but I never do. They might come out later. I don't know.
They might appear in another story, just some element of it might.
Yeah. That's the thing I get asked a lot about, my creative process.
Yes.
Which always baffles me because I don't really have one. Well, I suppose I do, but I just don't think about it.
Yeah.
I know other writers who'll be very comfortable talking about their whole writing process and their thoughts behind it. I don't have any thoughts behind it. I'm just working away at writing and trying to figure things out, trying to figure out a story and a setting.
And have you always been like that? Have you always been writing, or did you have other work before this that consumed you more and this sort of grew slowly? How did you arrive at becoming a writer?
I've had other jobs.
Yeah.
People have been foolish enough to employ me in a range of endeavours. I worked in a bakery, I worked in a bookshop, I worked in advertising. I used to put up those annoying posters around the uni that you tear little things off.
I did them, yeah.
Yeah, I had 3 jobs at once doing that. No, I've always written though.
Yeah.
I was a huge reader as a child. I was so fortunate in that my mother and my aunts and my English teachers always just filled my life with books.
Fabulous.
And I was just a voracious reader and still am, but just kind of in an obsessive way. It's all I ever wanted to do. And by the time I was 12, 13, I was writing stories on my own, and then throughout teenagers I became more moody and intense and kept doing more of it. And it never occurred to me to not do it. Yeah. So I don't have some sort of great origin moment of when I became a writer.
No.
It was such a consuming part of my life was reading, and I got a job in a bookshop when I was 15, and I can't remember any other time.
I often hear people say, they'll read a children's book or something like that. They say, I could write that. And I always think, unless you're actually writing it, you're not a writer.
Yeah, sometimes people start telling me about this idea they have for a story or a novel or the thing they're working on. I want to tell them very politely, stop telling me. Don't tell me. Go work on it. A, because you don't really, there's not anything unless you're doing it. And B, as soon as you start talking about it, you're kind of you're putting it out in the world without it existing, and you're putting expectations on people and upon yourself.
Yeah.
And suddenly next time you see that person, they'll be like, how's that story going? And maybe it's not going anymore, and you feel like a dick. Because, I told them, why did I tell them? And you should just keep it to yourself and just work away at it. It's probably really bad mental health advice, but as far as writing, it served me well.
Do you have a confidant or someone that you bounce ideas off on, someone like that in your life that you trust with those early ideas? Not
ideas, but work. I show work to some close friends. I've been part of a semi-formal writing group for the last 15 years.
Lovely.
We still kind of show each other work less and less as we get older and have more kids and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I still talk to them all the time. One of them, my friend Benny Walter, he's been reading my work, and I've been reading his work for nearly 15 years. He just got shortlisted for a Walkley.
Oh, so, wonderful.
Yeah, we're just so over the moon about that. In a way that you can be for your friends who you've been kind of in the ditches with each other's work for so long.
Yeah.
It's hard to express how excited you are. I'm sure lots of other writers feel this way when people they've been kind of collegial with like this. We're just so excited. And it's kind of like if I won an award, I'll be quite happy. But if Benny wins this Walkley, I'll be smashing windows.
You can really let go.
Yeah.
Well, I should take us back to the book, your latest book, Dusk. So to me, it's a book that really shares some really aching physical pain. I mean, your main characters, Floyd and Iris, they are cold, they are hungry. Floyd has, a terribly painful back. It makes me realise I'd never thought of this, how people survived before painkillers back, 50 or 100 years ago. It must have been excruciating to live with that sort of debilitating pain all the time. And it's also a book that I think there's a lot of sadness in those characters, in as much as there's one particular scene where Iris is shown kindness by one of the First Nations women, Lydia, and she's 37 and she sort of reflects back and she realises she was 12 the last time someone other than her brother was kind to her, which really made me feel very sad for her as a character. They do seem quite forlorn and without hope in their lives. And the chances of them succeeding in this quest to kill a puma without a gun in the Tasmanian highlands, it seems like there's almost no chance of success. The book obviously takes some twists and turns, and I don't want to spoil anything, but do you feel they had success? Was there success for them?
I feel like they had achievement throughout the novel. I don't necessarily call it success, but they certainly go through a lot and accomplish a lot, for good and for bad and for better and for worse. I don't know if I call it success, but they do live these quite brutal, harsh lives. And when it's not explicitly set in this colonial period of Tasmania, but it's so close to it, it may as well be, let's be honest. And when reflecting upon that period and looking into it, it's kind of looked at through rose-tinted glasses by most of Australia today. That period of Lutruwita Tasmanian history was essentially a form of government-attempted genocide over the Indigenous peoples, as well as essentially a form of government-bonded slavery for all the convictism. That's what it was. And then, just as Iris and Floyd are coming to their adulthood in this novel, they're in the decade beyond that, where that's only just stopped happening. And those ghosts and horrors are lingering all around them. And when the convict era and that colonial era of Australian history is often told, particularly, I don't know what it's like here on the Big Island, but there's always a sense of larrikinism and always a sense of get up and go, and aren't Australians laconic? And
we just cracked on.
We cracked on with everything. And the reality is one of extreme brutality and alienness. And yet there was still devotion to each other and still love, and above all, hard work. And I wanted that to be clear in the way these characters look at each other and the way they treat each other. Floyd and Iris, they're twins, and they're so devoted to each other and they drive each other crazy. But they'll never abandon each other, and they know this so clearly about themselves that it's never a question that needs to be answered. Lots of books deal with questions when the relationships arrive at a crisis point. I wanted to have these two protagonists to arrive on page one having that question answered, and to then be heading off on this quest without there being a will they or won't they be torn apart, because nothing would ever split them apart.
I think what you do so beautifully in this book, and particularly in Limberlost, which was my favourite book of last year, and I've read it. I've also just recently listened to it again on audiobook, which is a spectacular recording. I think what you do so beautifully in these books is you portray these people who are quiet, and they're humble, they're brave. They feel things very deeply, but they can't necessarily articulate them with words. And particularly when I was reading Limberlost, Ned was my grandfather. I just loved your portrayal of Ned and throughout his life. And you're so good at explaining how people are feeling without them giving the dialogue, with you explaining it for them almost. Were there people in your life who were like that you sort of model this on? Where do you get that special skill from?
I think most Australians know people like that, particularly Australian men, largely inarticulate, especially about expressing their emotions. And often that comes through in artistic portrayals as cruelty and harshness, and that is definitely part of our culture, don't get me wrong. But just as equally, there are tender people, and tenderness and love coming through in the way we treat each other, even if it's never expressed through words. And that's something I observed all my life. And I'm sure other people have too, because I thought I was writing Limberlost just about my grandfather. Thought I was just basing it solely on his life, and I worried that other people wouldn't be able to connect with it. And you're not the first person who said that to me, that it was like, and I'm very fortunate and honoured that people connect with it that way. But I think it more goes to show that there is a universality in parts of Australian culture that we can all connect to. And just because there are a lot of blokes out there who don't know how to talk about their feelings doesn't mean that they're bad people, or that they're cruel or harsh or indifferent. And I wanted that to come through in that book, and I think it probably comes through in this new one too. I'm much more comfortable writing about characters who are a bit inarticulate, but still do tremendous things for other people, whether for good or for bad, because that's how I think a lot of us are.
Yeah.
And I never this is almost more of a technical thing, I never like writing much from first point of view, because I like the idea of a reader coming to know the characters I've invented. And the way we come to know people is through their actions and reactions and behaviour, the choices they make and the things they do, and the things they say, rather than things they're thinking internally in their heads. So by always writing about, in most cases, writing in third-person point of view. We can introduce characters that way.
You can almost say more.
Yeah. I think you can reveal a greater truth about them by what they're saying and doing and how they're behaving, rather than what they're necessarily thinking. Because what we all think inside our own heads is kind of gobbledygook madness.
True.
Maybe that's just me. But
No, I think you're right.
it's somewhere between the chapter I'm working on, what time I need to pick my daughter up, what we need to buy at the shop, and, here's a line I'd like to write down somewhere. It's not coherent.
Yeah.
And so that's how I like to position the characters in the books, as people we come to know and meet through the truth of their words and actions.
You've had a child in recent times, and I read somewhere that you feel becoming a parent is part of what makes Dusk such a fabulous book.
Oh, I think I might have said that, I haven't slept for 18 months. My darling daughter, you know how you have a kid, you flip a coin and it either sleeps or it doesn't. This is something I'm sure everyone knows this.
Yeah.
It'd be boring to all the parents out there. But our wonderful daughter has only just started sleeping through the night. So I feel like a superhero in the morning now because I can feel like I can do anything. I thought I was very unwell and I just realised I've been sleep deprived.
Just a parent, yeah.
Yeah. So writing Dusk was almost like writing it in a fugue state. I remember very little about the actual writing process. Yeah, it was almost like writing in a heavy dream state. So maybe that comes through in the world of the book a little bit because
It is a very dreamy book. Absolutely. As Iris and Floyd are travelling through the highlands, they come across bones of all sorts of shapes and sizes, and they lend a very eerie sort of feeling to it all. What were you wanting for readers to take from these bones that were appearing throughout the narrative?
I never really want readers to take any one thing in particular. I just hope they'll find them evocative and engaging and resonant. Because when I thought about walking through this particular aspect of the high country and seeing what looked like large trees emerging from the earth, but then realising they're rib cages of an ancient sea beast, it felt to me it lent the landscape a really physical essence of time and the vastness of history. And when we think about Tasmania now, we think about the land bridge being cut off 15,000 years ago, cutting off people who'd already been there for 50,000 years, travelling back and forward, no longer travelling back and forward, and the 65,000 years of human history on that island, however much longer of animal history. And when you go to Europe or Asia, you have these great crumbling monuments of castles and palaces and things, and you get that sense of time, of civilization. But where I'm from, we don't have those physical manifestations. So I thought it'd be interesting to have something like that poking up from the ground in a way that's almost realistic, because most mountains were once seafloors.
Yeah. And I think for me, and you talk about what your readers might take of it, for me, I was reading that nothing remains buried. You can't, whatever has happened and you've tried to hide or that has been hidden for a time just naturally will reappear. It can't be denied. And that's what the bones felt like to me. They were just a reminder that there's a past that it can't be ignored. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great take out of it. I think that's absolutely true. I like the idea that everything changes but all the materials are the same, you know, except for the odd meteorite that crashes into Earth. All the elements are all still here and they're just being recycled, and that's as true of the dust in our boots to the lives we lead.
Beautiful. Our podcast is called Tsundoku, which means the pile of books beside your bed that you never get round to reading. Are you able to tell us what books you have piled up beside your bed that you're hoping to get to?
Yeah, there's quite a few there. I've just started Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. I'm a really big Rachel Kushner fan. She's amazing, so I'm just about getting into that. There's a vintage. I've just released a few Mishima books, so I've got The Sound of Waves next to me there too. I've just finished Deep Water by James Bradley, one of my favourite books of the year. There's a couple of hundred other books on there. But Deep Water is the last one that really knocked me for six.
Yeah.
It's an amazing exploration of the world's oceans. It's historic, it's emotional, it's personal, it's scientific.
Fabulous.
It's just an incredible book.
And are there books that you return to time and time again?
There are, yeah. I read Old School by Tobias Wolff every couple of years. It meant a lot to me as a young man. I don't want to give too much away, but it's just a beautiful novella set in a boarding school in New England in America, where all the boys are excited because it's rumoured that Hemingway is coming to visit. Sounds very pretentious. It's not. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
And it just meant heaps to me when I was 16. When I'm sick, I read The Hobbit.
Yeah?
I sometimes read that to my wife when she's sick too. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah.
I can't really explain why, but just trust me, if you have a really bad cold, just sit down and read The Hobbit, and it's really helpful.
It'll fix what ails you.
Yeah. No, I won't fix anything, but it'll distract you.
And it's not a short book, so you've got plenty of time to get better, haven't you?
There's something to the kind of the folkloric rhythm to it as well. I wouldn't read Lord of the Rings because there's too much vast grandioseness going on and the listing of all the characters' names that are the same. But The Hobbit, it's like I don't know, it does something for you when you're unwell.
That's a brilliant recommendation. Thank you.
Oh, no worries.
Well, Robbie, you're a superb writer, and I just think we're so lucky that you've given us the books that you have. I've devoured Dusk, and I'm sure many people will, and I just want to thank you for your time today and for talking to me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And I really appreciated it too, a lovely chance to speak to a great writer. That was Robbie Arnott, author of Dusk.
Hannah Ferguson is a bit of a dynamo. She's managed by the age of 25 to front up a media company and to have a podcast and to basically author a couple of books, talk about overachiever. This is your woman. She's a young feminist. Her first book looked at feminist issues, and her second book is taking that in a different tangent. It's looking at taboos that we live with in our communications, and she sort of tries to identify the ways that we can have better conversations about things, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about things that ultimately end up with us having better outcome in the end, whether it's relationships, sex, whether it's the concept of being a girl boss, having it all, whether it's body modifications and the beauty standards. She's sort of taking all of those issues that I guess have been discussed in literature for time immemorial, but she's adding that millennial Gen. What are we now? Gen Alpha.
The latest gen.
She's lending a new generation's perspective to these issues and sort of uncovering them. So here's Hannah.
I'm a 26-year-old woman living in Australia, and I feel like so much of what I'm experiencing at the moment is this really strong feminist social political discourse coming through, but still just a bunch of conversations we're not having. So I'm really interested in conversations around hookup culture, around gossip and the perception of women, around the sort of death of the girl boss era of millennial feminism and how we actually approach conversations about things like the choice to become a mother, the choice to get married. As a woman entering that kind of next stage, I want to talk about the conversations that I feel like women in their 20s aren't having or are too scared to have still.
You've broken it down into sections in the book, separating it into body, sex, relationships, work, friendships. So you've identified these kind of key areas that women are not having conversations, not only with men and not only publicly, but also with one another.
Yeah, and I think that is something where in my friend groups, we're very progressive, we're very open, and there's still certain things that we don't discuss. And I think often it can be, we may talk about big instances in relationship breakdowns, but often we're not talking about things like fertility and medical misogyny, or when it comes to friendship, often we have different perceptions of how our friendship should be and how they actually teeter off when we decide to have children and how they affect our kind of life trajectory. But also things like, I think the conversations and the mental load and the emotional load that we take on in our relationships that we kind of fail to recognize and discuss even with each other. I think female friendship is a place of solace, but there's still very much a silence and a kind of judgment and taboo around certain conversations and what's acceptable and what's not.
And it's also about how to have those conversations respectfully, but also to respect your right to pipe up. So sometimes I think we're a little bit careful about how we talk about things.
Yeah, and I think we're experiencing a major drought in respectful, healthy discussions, and that's in the political arena at the moment with social media. It's inflammatory, it's divisive, but I think also the way that bleeds into our personal lives is that we feel like anytime we say anything express concern, that it is a hard line when it's not. We don't really have space for nuance. So if you say, oh, my partner and I, we had this fight or discussion or we're having this sort of discourse or breakdown, sometimes it's a huge judgment call made about them as well. And we're seeing a lot of black and white and not much grey area in the kinds of conversations we're having where those judgments are kind of held for longer terms and those grudges. And so I think this book is not about saying, oh, because I'm anti-cosmetic procedures, I judge women who get Botox. I'm just saying I want to discuss the industry that's led us to judge each other and ourselves more than the actual people that are commodifying our self-hatred.
Yeah, a bit more of an interrogation of those social constructs that are sitting around us and inform what we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
You brought up just before the mental load. And again, is that a hard thing to have that conversation sometimes? It's almost like another layer of adding something more to the mental load to have to kind of break it down and explain what it is.
Yeah. I think that's something we all find, right? Like, I often apologise or just call it out when I'm getting... So, for example, like last week I had a friend who said, want to go out to dinner next week, blah, blah, blah. And I just said to her, could you pick the place and book it in? Because I know I'm passing the mental load to you. I just know that you're better at it. But if you want me to do it, I can. Like, I think often just saying the words mental load and acknowledging you're putting it on someone, you're transferring it, can be all the difference. Just like the awareness that, it's kind of an acknowledgement and a gratitude towards people that do carry it. Like, I always saw a really good TikTok earlier this year that said, some people say that they go with the flow, but the flow is your type A eldest daughter friend who's managing the entire group's vacation. Like, it's kind of interesting the way that we just fail to acknowledge or understand that someone is doing the work and other people benefit from that.
My experience as a woman is that I feel like I carry the majority of that in a relationship, but sometimes it's my lack of willingness to let something go, perhaps a little bit of a controlling aspect of my personality. It's hard to sometimes separate and have a constructive conversation when you know that part of it's personality type A and part of it's the fact that it's just the way it's always been.
I think that is such a great point because I struggle with this too. And I think a lot of women do too because we've been conditioned to believe that we must carry, we must organise, we must bear that burden and brunt. And passing it off when you've been so conditioned to know you're good at it and that it is your duty or like it kind of becomes a moral obligation even though it's absolutely not. But we see it as one often. And when we know we're good at it, passing it off means taking a risk that if it doesn't go well, we also feel some sort of responsibility for that failure even though it's not. So I think there's so much emotion and tightness caught up in that control that when we give it away, if it doesn't go how we want or how we would do it, there's a level of judgment and shame that can be applied subconsciously to the person that has had a go and tried. I think that in order to give up the mental load, what's really important is acknowledging the need to have it and why we have it, but then also accepting, and it is quite a difficult thing to accept, that when you pass it off, you can't criticise or have a massive go at someone who wouldn't have done it your way. You have to give it up with the belief that it's now someone else's responsibility and you can't project manage that person through that process, which is hard.
Another thing you raised, which I found really interesting, and probably because I'm a Gen X, and so your discussion around work and around the need to do everything that women often experience, this idea that you want to deliver at work, you want to overachieve, you want to show yourself of value, and there's that drive, I think, that was almost generationally built in. Certainly I've found that. And then your argument, which I loved, which is valuing doing what works for you and giving yourself space and rest and time.
Yeah, and I think, that comes from a place also where I grew up in a regional conservative town in New South Wales in Orange, and I went to like a Catholic school, and there's a lot of girls from my grade, and I talk about this in the book, that just became mothers instantly. They got married, they had babies, some of them have 3 kids, and I'm 26, they've got 3 kids in school. And I remember being so judgmental and thinking like, but we have the ability to work now and go out and chase our dreams and travel. And like, I remember being so caught up in, but we can have it all now and we can work and then have children and go off and be our own people. I'm confused. I remember my mum actually like sitting me down and saying like, just because someone made a different choice to you doesn't mean that's the wrong choice, Hannah. And for the longest time, I think I saw it as some sort of failure that we have the ability to work and enjoy in a different capacity to 100 years ago and that people don't choose that. And now I realise, no, that was fundamentally me as a younger woman undervaluing the role of motherhood in society and like kind of buying into like the conditioning we receive under patriarchy that it's not hard work and it's not a really valuable life path. And I think now it's this conversation of, well, if I wanted to become a parent in the next few years, I would want to take time off because I wouldn't want to be running around not spending time with my child or neglecting work. I would want to have the freedom and capacity to choose and to not feel like I have to juggle everything to be like, in inverted quotations, the right kind of woman in this sort of modern day. And I think that conversation is really important. But also, how do we have that conversation and actually empower women to be financially stable in the current economy too? I think that's a lot of the concern. So I think I'm just trying to pick apart this having it all idea and say, what's next when we leave the girl boss behind?
And acknowledging that any domestic labour is labour as well, and it's undervalued and certainly not paid. That doesn't diminish what contribution a person is doing if they choose to be a homemaker, a carer, and raise children and dedicate themselves in that direction.
Yeah, and we know that it's like the biggest, most underpaid industry, and we know that women are doing on average at least 30% more, I think it is, of unpaid labour, domestic labour each week. And women are not only expected to do unpaid care labour, but every care industry is also underpaid, undervalued, and women dominated.
The theme that I read right through your book, and I found this really heartening because it's genuine, is that you presented academic arguments and intellectual arguments for a whole bunch of different aspects of life, but then you reflected on your own personal experiences. In some situations, you understand everything intellectually, but your own personal way that you approach it is contradictory to that. What's your thoughts on how those challenges arise and how you can overcome that?
The part that's really important to me is that when I speak about any topic is that I explain how I got to my opinions through my own personal experience and then what I learned through the research, right? And often when those things contradict, it's actually more important to show people that those things contradict, because I want to be able to sit with the discomfort of my experiences led me here, data, research, anecdotal experiences of other has led me to understand this now, and where do I find myself in the middle of these two things? Because I just think that's a rare conversation to be having. I'm not seeing it enough in spaces especially dominated by Gen Z and millennials. And I noticed with my previous book, Bite Back, I tried to kind of take myself out of it and only have a few pages of every chapter that were personal experience. And every single review I got said that the personal experiences were the parts that resonated and had the most impact. So I kind of took that and injected it more into Taboo. My thoughts are that I just never want to be someone who only displays like shiny moments. I really think it's important to provide anecdotes that show my own personal confusion navigating a certain topic, but also parts where I was deeply wrong. Because I think in order to ask people to interrogate themselves, you have to be able to display like deeply that you have been wrong, offensive, and, you know, engaged in the kind of not mistreatment, but the kinds of conversations where you've walked away thinking, oh, I might have hurt that person or caused damage or harm, and I need to be able to learn from that experience in order to do better and have better conversations and discussions that have outcomes that I desire, which is I don't want to convince someone of my perspective. I just want to share perspectives so we can both critically think about a certain subject. And I think that's where the pairing of research and anecdote that conflict is really important.
Yeah, I really liked it. I mean, we're all fallible, we're all works in progress, and I would challenge anyone to reflect on many, many, many circumstances in their lives that they haven't gone, oh, I got that a little bit off, didn't I? Or and even just over time, you know, me then and me now, I wouldn't have done that way then. I've evolved and here I am. That's real.
I hope it is. Like, some of the subjects, people will probably, you know, my grandma reads my books and she's probably so deeply like, oh my God, I can't believe my blood has put this into print and on shelves. But I also think that my family, it's so interesting. They read what I've written and they're obviously uncomfortable because it's a lot about sex and body and all these things. But I think the biggest thing, and that's what's shown through a lot of anecdotes that are about my personal life, is that all the people in those stories know and have consented to having their own mistakes broadcast as well, which is really powerful. I disagree with my parents, my friends a lot, but we're really good at disagreeing, and that's what matters most to me.
Friendships is your last subject in the book, and I think maintaining, establishing and not losing them along the way as life churns and grows, but also understanding what serves you and what doesn't. That's such a valuable skill and something that is worth talking about.
It's so interesting because I often find that female friendship is just the most deprioritized, not only in our own lives, but when we're talking about it in popular culture, like when it comes to media about friendships and TikToks and things, I find them very much not getting the recognition and discussion they deserve. And that's why I really wanted to inject it into the book as well, because I think it's an untapped space in conversation. And I think it's really reflective of our romantic relationships and what value we apply to each. And so one of the things I've noticed a lot of the time with my Instagram and how that kind of reflects what I've written as well is people will send me questions that are like, I don't feel like my friend is putting enough time into my friendship, or they're always busy, or blah, blah, blah. And I'm someone who's very much like, we never discuss our approach to friendship or what we look for and the kind of hierarchical structure or what our time commitments are. We only really ever see it as like, this person I want to see all the time and they don't want to see me and therefore I feel rejected, instead of actually kind of inquiring as to Are they, struggling with their child? Do they only want to see me once a week in like a side-to-side friendship, which is like going to the theatre or doing a class together, as opposed to a dinner friendship, like a face-to-face kind of environment? Do they have a best friend and I'm beneath that? Why do I feel rejected or offended by that kind of structure? Like, we never really interrogate the value we place or the way we kind of rank and order friendships in our lives. And I think that that kind of plays into a lot of our loneliness, isolation, and our determinations on the quality of our friendship. So a lot of the conversations I want to have in this book are about why we've undervalued and kind of got this really low emotional intelligence around those topics, how they compare to romantic relationships, and what we could learn from both.
Yeah, I found it really insightful in how easily people can become sort of precious about something, but realistically a conversation would resolve it. That's kind of what you're getting at with all of this. I mean, you talk about sex, having those conversations, having conversations throughout, before, after, like what works, what doesn't, paying attention, listening to one another. I mean, that's the most intimate space.
And it's saying to people of course you're going to be defensive. Of course you're going to be sensitive. It's so vulnerable to have a conversation with a sexual partner about what might be going wrong, what could be better. But we know, we can step back from that when we're outside of that experience and go, yes, fundamentally, everything would improve if I was capable of having one uncomfortable conversation. Yet our nervous system is so unable to engage in the moment that we end up completely running away and would rather suffer for years when we know we have the ability to elevate the experience very simply. And sex is one of the chapters, but you're right, it's reflected in all of them. That my entire argument is our capacity for discomfort and for the taboo is genuinely the difference between a good and bad relationship.
Hannah Ferguson, she's the author of Taboo, which you can pick up anywhere now, and you can also listen to her podcast if you like, which is Big Small Talk.
So let's talk about the year that was. Who wants to kick off with their favourite book of the year? Kath?
Oh, Lordy, I think my favourite book of the year was The Red Children by Maggie G, who's an English author who's been writing for a very long time. She's always ahead of her time. I think I first met her through a book called My Driver, and it was set in post-colonial Africa with a rather staid English woman and her driver. And I thought, oh, this woman's amazing. She's a great writer. And then I found she'd written a book called My Cleaner in the same sort of vein. And more recently, I discovered a book of hers called The White Children. It had been reissued in 2022, 20th anniversary of its publication, so people were still thinking it was a fantastic book. And then she wrote The Red Children, and that is set in the near future in Kent, in Ramsgate, where she sets a lot of her work, where she lives. And these rather strange people turn up on the beach, and they're slightly odd looking, very, very congenial, happy, willing and able people, strong, healthy. They integrate quite well. They learn English, which they didn't know. So it's kind of a fable about migration and that as a permanent feature of human life. And I'm not giving too much away. It says on the back cover that these people are in fact Neanderthals who've been living under the Rock of Gibraltar for thousands of years, happily, going on with a civilization and a culture. And anyway, it's about what happens to them in this community in the near future. And I just thought it was audacious, brilliantly written, and so telling, so clever.
It reminds me of that television series that we all said we liked, Foreigners. Do you remember that?
Be Foreigners.
Be Foreigners.
Be Foreigners, that's it. Yeah.
Absolutely like that. It was very similar. You would love it, Annie. You put me on to Be
That's
Foreigners.
one of my very favourites ever. All those people popping up through the harbour.
Yeah, well, it was just like that.
History.
Exactly.
So, Annie, what's your best read of 2024?
Well, I just remembered one that I read earlier in the year that I absolutely loved, which was Emily St. John Mandel, called The Sea of Tranquility, and it's set about 3 centuries ahead when the moon has been the moon has been settled, but it's almost become a bit down at heel. Like they've got a problem with the sun because they've got a fake sun to simulate day and night, but unfortunately it's on all the time. That bit really stuck in my mind, but it's an amazing book. It really is. Yeah, set so far in the future, and just that idea of it's colonisation in a future setting. But Beasting was the one I really wanted to read and absolutely loved till I got to the end and felt absolutely shattered, like most people did. It's funny when you say you're reading a book and people who've read it look at you with this look in their eye and you know
you're in for something.
Yes. See, I don't think we ever discussed the end, Danny. I read it after you.
Well, you can't now.
I wasn't.
No, we can't now.
But I've got to say, I wasn't disappointed.
No, but I was upset.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'm too sensitive.
No, but I can understand why people are upset. But I just found it thrilling. I was satisfied.
It was a
I know
racy
people
read.
were unsatisfied at the end of that book, but I was satisfied.
Amazing layering of the 4 different people and the different ways they spoke, and a lot of people early on criticised, as they do with quite a few books these days, punctuation. Suddenly,
the way it was laid out.
But actually, it was so perfect. It was so
I
perfect,
agree.
and you really understood so many parts of life that you don't normally get an insight into, like what it's like to be a child in this time of social media and weird things happening online and things like that. Anyway, that's one. The other book that I've just read, sorry, I have to give this a big plug because I'm a huge fan of Robert Harris.
Yes.
And it
I
was the
love
only
Robert
book
Harris
I could find
too.
at the airport the other day. Precipice. Oh, such a good read. I now understand World War One. I now totally get it. And it's based on a real story, a really amazing real story about how the Prime Minister was actually having a hot affair through that absolutely terrible and torrid time.
Which Prime Minister?
Asquith, Henry Asquith.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, I read Fatherland decades ago by Robert Harris, and this is where it's a sort of the alternate ending of World War II and Hitler wins, and then just what the world shapes up to be in the aftermath of that. And I loved it. I don't know why I haven't returned to any more of his books, but I'm going to borrow that one from you because I need to understand what happened with Arch Ferdinand, the Duke, or whatever. What's his name?
I know. All these years I could not work out why that mattered so much, that one person got shot from on horseback, wasn't it?
I think I've had a snobbish prejudice against Robert Harris all these years because I only ever see him in airport bookstores. And I thought, oh no, that's not for me. I think I better catch up.
Reassess, Kath.
Yeah.
Actually, my very favourite was his first, I don't know if it was his first book, but the one I came across was Pompeii, which really has this amazing build-up to the volcano erupting. You know it's going to erupt, but so clever.
It has an
takes you into the-
inevitability about
Spoiler alert.
and the lives of the people in those days and the Roman people writing poetry at a distance. And, you know, it's just the most fascinating book.
Oh, good. Sarah?
It took me a minute, but then the book Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
I
read
loved it.
that early in the year, and just thinking about a book. Well, I've got 2, and I think both of them struck me because they are sort of singular types of book. And Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, a story of a boy and a girl who sort of grew up trying to create this gaming development company. So it was just something very different for me, and their experiences trying to chart their way through this world, and then the relationships that kind of shattered that. It ended up in a sort of bit of a climax that was, you know, totally unbelievable,
Yeah,
but
it
kind of wild.
Yeah.
But I liked the way it was written and took me away into one of those places that literature can. The other, which was more recent, is All Fours by Miranda July, which was just beyond, like, that was just breathtaking from start to finish. And it was just a woman's exploration of herself within a relationship and looking for new ways to experience herself, her body, interactions with other people. And it just, blew my mind because it was such an unusual story and so personally written. You know, it's when I've listened to a podcast where she spoke to Esther Perel afterwards about, you know, just how closely aligned her real life is to what she wrote about in All Fours.
It's very, very close.
It's very close to an autobiographical story, but it's sort of a slightly fictionalised version, and it's, you know, those blurred lines in how you explore what your world could be, you know. I found that fascinating.
I think the people in her life probably recognise themselves in that story.
I would think so, don't you? I don't think she hides it too well.
No, one of the things I loved about it too, though, it was quite funny. It's really
it's
amusing, hilarious read.
Yes.
So it isn't earnest.
It's outrageous in so many ways,
Yes.
and I loved it. There were no taboos, so that ties in really well with talking about Hannah earlier.
And Michaela, I think you and I both wanted to give a special mention to Paddy
Yes.
O'Reilly, Other Houses.
Exactly. You interviewed her, I think it was episode 35, Paddy O'Reilly's book, Other Houses. And I was trying to think about my book of the year, and I thought, which book just made me go, and that one did. And I won't say when, where or how, but it's basically the story of Lily, who's a cleaner in Melbourne, and her partner Janks, who works in a factory, and Julie, Jewellee, Lily's daughter, which they're trying to give her a different life. They're trying to make the right choices. And it comes apart at the seams.
For very sort of astutely recognised politico-economic reasons, they're people in the poverty trap with no real way out.
No.
And they are bound to come a cropper. It's not their fault.
Well, this is why I found it so interesting, because I think I did also listen to it in the audiobook, which I thought was brilliantly acted with the sort of male and female voices. But often people say to me, I have a really good life, but, I worked hard for it and I made good choices, and I think that's true. I feel the same way about myself. I've really given it my best shot. But there are people who work so hard and try to make the right choices, and because they're from the wrong end of the tracks, usually, it doesn't end well.
Their wages
it's not
will never
QED.
cover
no.
what they need to give their children a good life.
Yeah, for that reason, I thought it was a really good insight into why you see people never get ahead no matter how many jobs they work. It's not just about the jobs. There's a level of advantage that you're either born with or you're not.
That's right. It was one of those books where you think, acknowledge your privilege here.
Yeah, I did the whole way through, and it was great. So anyway, there was that one. So, and I'll kick off the next round of things because we were going to talk about our favourite, the book that we would like to have appear in our Christmas stocking. And for me, it's going to be Orbital by Samantha Harvey.
Oh, I'm reading that right now.
Oh, are you? Well, she won the Booker Prize this year. It's about astronauts on a space station. They're conducting their experiments, and mostly what they're doing, I believe, this is in the blurb, is that they're looking at Earth and they're feeling the pull of home. And I just feel this is a time where I need to read a book that's a little bit uplifting, that celebrates our beautiful planet and the amazing opportunity we have to live on it. And I feel she might be a kindred spirit, someone who says life is good, let's look after it. And that's what I need to read. So, hints out there, anyone? Oh, actually, I can take your copy when you're finished, can't I, Kat? So great. Yeah, yay, Christmas dreams have been
I'm reading it
answered.
online. I will send it to your Dropbox.
Thank you. So, Annie, what do you want in your Christmas stocking?
I've got my eye on a book called Caledonian Road by Andrew O'Hagan. So I'm purely going on recommendation here. My sister tells me it's fantastic, and it's also very big. So when you get into a book that you love, it's really nice when it's large. That's why I enjoyed Precipice, actually. I thought, still got lots to go
You
yet.
can stay in the universe a bit longer.
Yes.
You've read that one, haven't you?
Yes,
Okay.
I have. And I was less impressed than a lot of people. I liked a lot of the threads in it, but I thought the author was trying a little bit hard to impress you with his take on current theories of everything, and you were supposed to pat yourself on the back if you thought, oh yes, I got that reference, or I do understand what you mean there, aren't I clever?
Well, we'll have to discuss that after.
We'll have to discuss that after. I liked a lot of things about it.
Yeah. Excellent. And so what's yours, Sarah?
The one I'd like to read is Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, and I understand it's a very sparse book. I think, Kathy, you were saying that to me earlier, that it's very sparse and very spacious type of a story.
Yes, spacious, good.
What I've found with the books I've previously read of Charlotte Wood's is that each time that she turns her mind to a story and a concept is quite uniquely different to the last thing she wrote. She doesn't write a type, she writes a story, and I really appreciate the worlds that she takes me into.
Like Geraldine Brooks, who can go from, was from horse racing to the plague. Yeah,
absolutely.
To women in
absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Nine Paths to Zayek, what a book.
So I just think, I'd quite happily give anything that Charlotte Wood writes a go, and so this is her latest, and it's just one I haven't got myself around to reading this year, so I thought that'll be the one. And the other one I'm going to try and sneak in is I reread, as you know, Shantaram this year, and the next one I want to reread this year, which I realise isn't on my bookshelf, even though I usually hold on to the books I'm going to reread, is called Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón.
You've read that, Annie, haven't you?
Literally one of my favourite books ever. It's just breathtaking, and so I'm going to, even if that doesn't turn up in my stocking, it might turn up in my shopping bag and on my Tsundoku sometime very soon.
I love that book so much. That was another favourite this year. Amazing book.
It's just magical. I love it.
And Kath, you're lucky last.
Well, it's something that I've been waiting for a while. And there aren't too many books that I'm aware of that I'm desperate to read, but one of my favourite crime writers is Belinda Bauer, Bauer. She wrote a fabulous book called Snap that actually got longlisted for the Booker Prize, and it was about kids who were whose father was looking after them, but he was hopelessly depressed, and they were going out breaking into houses and stealing things so that the family could stay together. So it was tangentially a crime novel, but it was just a fantastic story. She's a brilliant storyteller. And then she wrote Exit, about this group of people called the Exiteers, who were helping people who wanted to die and couldn't because legally it was impossible for them. So they would check out the circumstances and then turn up with their little canister of whatever it was that would help. Anyway, that was also slightly dark but funny, and she's a very
that's
good
what
writer.
I first thought. I thought that sounds so funny.
So it actually was terrific. I just think she's a great writer. So her next book is called The Impossible Thing, and I've been waiting for that to come out all year, and now I think it's coming out in February. So I'll have Christmas in February with that one.
Well, I feel like that was a Tsundoku tsunami for us today. Not just a great couple of chats, but some fantastic suggestions and reflections from the year. It's been a pleasure to join you all around the table and do this all together.
It is, and we should do it more often. In fact, that's our promise for next year.
more tsunamis. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Kath Keneally.
Have a lovely Christmas.
Yeah, Merry
Reading.
Christmas.
Merry Christmas all.